It's easy, from the comfortable vantage of a 21st century bathtub, to imagine that bathing has always been a given part of daily life. Water flows with the turn of a knob. Soap comes in a dozen scents, and cleanliness has become synonymous with health and civility. But rewind to a village in 14th century England, and the story is rather different. If you were lucky, you bathed once a year, and that was probably a family event. Not because medieval people were ignorant or lazy, but because hygiene looked very different before modern plumbing, commercial soaps, and germ theory. Let's begin not in the castle halls of kings, but among the ordinary villagers, the backbone of medieval society. You are a tenant farmer in a hamlet of roughly 150 people. Your home is a wattle and daub structure with a thatched roof, the floor mostly compacted earth. There is no indoor plumbing, and the nearest stream is half a mile away. Water is labor-intensive. Fetching it requires physical effort, and heating it consumes valuable firewood. And in many places, water is not safe to use unless it's boiled. You rise with the sun and sleep when it sets. In between, your day is filled with physical toil, tending fields, feeding animals, maintaining your home. You sweat, yes, but you are not alone. Everyone smells roughly the same. The social pressure to remain clean is measured against entirely different standards. So how did people clean themselves? It would be wrong to say they never did. Most medieval villagers practiced a kind of piecemeal hygiene. Washing hands and face in the morning with cold water was common. Many people carried small cloths, Manus wipes, to clean themselves. Linen undergarments were prized because they absorbed sweat and oils, and they were easier to wash than outer garments made of wool. Bathing, when it occurred, was a major operation. Wooden tubs had to be filled with heated water bucket by bucket. The labor to heat enough water for a bath was not trivial. Wood, remember, was not free. If you used a cartload of it to heat water instead of cooking or heating the home, that was a luxury. Interestingly, communal bathhouses existed in towns and cities through much of the Middle Ages. Influenced by Roman traditions, public bathhouses served multiple purposes: hygiene, relaxation, and socialization. Men and women often bathed separately, but sometimes schedules overlapped. These bathhouses, sometimes called stews, were not entirely benign, however. By the late 14th century, they were increasingly associated with immoral behavior. The connection between bathhouses and brothels became pronounced, and by the 16th century, most were closed under pressure of rising moral standards and feared disease. In villages, however, public bathhouses were rare. Bathing was usually reserved for special occasions, religious festivals, weddings, or as a means of spiritual cleansing before important life events. Historical records refer to people taking a bath at midsummer or before Michaelmas. Often, entire families bathed in succession using the same water. Elders first, children last. The misconception that people were perpetually filthy stems in part from our own changing standards. The association of bathing with morality is largely a modern invention. In the Middle Ages, cleanliness was about appearance and odor, not microscopic pathogens. Clean clothes, a neat beard, and combed hair went a long way. Monasteries and nunneries actually had detailed bathing rules. Monks could bathe several times a year and more often if ill. Wealthier households had servants who heated and carried water for them, allowing for more regular baths. Soap existed but looked and smelled nothing like today's lavender-scented bars. It was often a mixture of animal fat and wood ash, harsh on the skin and rough to handle. In some regions, especially where olive oil was available, softer forms of soap were made. But again, this was a luxury product. Interestingly, the Black Death in the 14th century changed perceptions of cleanliness. People began to fear that hot water and open pores made the body vulnerable to disease. A new wave of bathing skepticism arose, especially in urban centers where crowded bathhouses were suspected of spreading plague. Ironically, this led to a reduction in public bathing just as the need for hygiene may have been increasing. Despite all this, the idea that medieval people were unaware of cleanliness is untrue. Their standards were different but not non-existent. Diaries, church records, and even medical texts discuss hygiene practices. Doctors recommended washing hands and face frequently and brushing teeth with mixtures of salt, sage, and vinegar. Let's also consider the architectural evidence. Some castles and monasteries featured rudimentary plumbing systems. The Cistercians, for example, designed sophisticated water channels for washing. Latrines drained into cesspits or rivers. Though crude by our standards, these were significant feats of engineering. Still, for the average peasant, life was dictated by the balance between survival and comfort. If heating water for a bath meant going without warmth a night, the decision was obvious. So the once-a-year bath was not a product of ignorance. It was a calculation of labor, fuel, and time. But if bathing was so rare and difficult, what did people do instead to stay comfortable or presentable? How did society view body odor, and were there remedies for it? These questions lead us to the next phase of our story. If you're imagining the air of a medieval village as a suffocating cloud of unwashed humanity, you're not entirely wrong. But the reality was subtler and in some ways surprisingly nuanced. Medieval people were deeply aware of smells. In fact, the entire theory of disease before the advent of germ theory rested on the concept of miasma, the belief that bad air, especially foul odors, cause illness. And so, smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. This fear of bad smells shaped hygiene practices, public health policy, and even architecture. Cities developed ordinances about refuse, open latrines, and animal pens. In 14th century London, the dumping of waste into the street was punishable by fine. In Paris, the authorities built public latrines known as latrines publiques, although these were seldom maintained. Still, the attempt reveals a genuine concern for sanitation, at least where it intersected with smell. Let's step into the daily routine of a common villager. You might begin the day by wiping your face with a cloth dampened in cold water. If you had the means, you'd use a rag soaked in rose water or vinegar. This wasn't simply cosmetic. It was believed to protect the body from illness by blocking the entry of foul air. Some wealthier individuals carried scented pomanders, small balls of herbs or spices wrapped in cloth, worn on the belt or around the neck. These acted like personal air filters. People also changed their clothes more often than we tend to think. Underclothes, shirts, and chemises made of linen were washed with some regularity, especially compared to woolen outerwear. Linen absorbed body oils and sweat, and washing was far easier than bathing the entire body. A 14th century laundry list from a French abbey mentions monks washing their linen every 2 weeks, a frequency considered generous by medieval standards. And then there were dry cleaning alternatives. The use of herbs was widespread. Fresh rushes and herbs like lavender, chamomile, or mint were strewn across floors to mask odors and deter pests. People rubbed dried herbs onto their skin, or even chewed aromatic leaves to refresh breath. In some regions, wood ash or crushed rosemary was used to scrub the skin, a sort of medieval exfoliant. Women's grooming practices also contributed to personal hygiene. Historical documents describe women combing their hair regularly, sometimes scented with oils or herbs. Combs were common archaeological finds across Europe, often made from bone, wood, or horn. Hair was frequently braided or covered, helping to manage lice and keep it cleaner over time. Hair washing did happen, usually with plain water or with soapwort, a naturally sudsing plant. Interestingly, medieval medical theory often cautioned against overbathing. Doctors believed that opening the pores through warm water could allow disease to enter the body. Consequently, full-body immersion was approached with caution, especially during outbreaks of plague or the sweating sickness. As a result, more emphasis was placed on local washing, hands, face, feet, and on maintaining a balanced environment within the body through diet and behavior. When bathing was attempted, it wasn't done alone. Wealthier households might have a bathhouse or bathing chamber, complete with wooden tub, heated stones, and scented water. Families often shared bathwater, in part to conserve fuel and effort. And yet, even in these cases, modesty was observed. Special bathing shirts were sometimes worn to avoid full nudity. Descriptions from the 15th century mention linen garments that clung to the body during baths, serving as both modest cover and functional scrub cloth. And what about dental hygiene? Contrary to popular belief, people did clean their teeth. Toothpicks and rudimentary brushes existed, along with recipes for mouthwashes made from vinegar, mint, and wine. A 12th century medical manuscript recommends using a mixture of sage and salt to keep teeth white and breath fresh. While dental decay was common, especially among the wealthy, who consumed more sugar, it wasn't universal. In fact, many skeletal remains from peasant cemeteries show surprisingly healthy teeth, due in part to a diet low in refined sugars and high in coarse grains. Let's also not forget the religious dimension of cleanliness. Washing had symbolic as well as physical meaning. Before prayer or entering a holy site, it was common to wash hands, feet, or face. In Islamic cultures, ablutions were and are an essential part of daily worship. Christian monasteries also emphasize cleanliness, though more for order and discipline than for health. Another fascinating wrinkle. During the early Renaissance, public baths made something of a comeback in cities like Florence and Prague. Influenced by contact with the Islamic world, where bathing was more culturally embedded, European travelers brought back stories of clean, fragrant bathhouses. In the 13th century, returning crusaders described tiled bathhouses in the Middle East where people bathed regularly in warm water with scented oils and attendants. For a time, this inspired imitation. But once again, fears of disease and moral corruption eventually led to their decline. It's worth noting that all of these practices existed along a social gradient. The poorest villagers had the fewest resources and the harshest realities. Water access, fuel, clothing, and tools for washing were limited by necessity. Nobles, clergy, and merchants had more time, space, and knowledge for managing hygiene. But even they operated under prevailing beliefs of the time. Cleanliness was relative, contextual, and governed by practical concerns. And so, as we think back to the once-a-year bath, we might ask, was it really the filth that defined the Middle Ages, or was it our modern framing that fails to grasp the logic of their world? Because despite everything, many people lived long enough to raise families, work the land, and pass down traditions. Their resilience was not accidental. It was carefully balanced with the realities of their time. But what happened when that balance broke? What did hygiene, or the lack of it, look like during times of disaster, plague, and war? By now, you've seen how hygiene in the medieval world was never as simple or as crude as modern myths suggest. It was a complex calculus of availability, belief, and practicality. But what happened when the already precarious system collapsed under pressure? When the rhythms of daily life were disrupted by plague, famine, or war, hygiene wasn't just deprioritized, it became impossible. Let's begin with the most infamous of all medieval disasters, the Black Death. Sweeping through Europe between 1347 and 1351, the plague killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. Entire villages vanished. Towns became ghostly, their streets littered with corpses, churches silenced, and markets empty. In the chaos, public hygiene plummeted. People fled the cities, abandoning the sick and the dying. Bodies often went unburied for days. Streets filled with waste, as municipal workers succumbed to disease or fled their posts. The very concept of organized cleanliness faltered, but it wasn't just infrastructure that collapsed. Theories of hygiene and health were also upended. Remember, at this time, miasma theory dominated medical understanding, the idea that disease spread through bad air or foul smells. People burned incense, walked with herbs stuffed in their noses, and kept windows tightly shut. Ironically, the avoidance of fresh air in an attempt to ward off disease may have contributed to its spread in enclosed, unhygienic spaces. One tragic irony is that bathhouses, previously places of refreshment and occasional cleansing, were now feared as breeding grounds of contagion. The same moist, warm environments once associated with health and leisure became suspect. In some areas, municipal bathhouses were closed permanently. Washing the body was seen as opening the pores, letting disease enter. This new fear of water persisted into the Renaissance and early modern periods. For centuries after Black Death, some people avoided bathing altogether. Instead, they layered perfumes and powders, changed clothing more frequently, and scrubbed the body with cloths or abrasive herbs. Full-body bathing became a rarity, even among the elite. During times of war, cleanliness took on different forms of neglect. Soldiers marched for days without access to water or proper latrines. Camps often became breeding grounds for lice, dysentery, and typhus. The 15th century Burgundian military records described a stench of unwashed men packed together in siege camps, so strong it overwhelmed even seasoned commanders. Yet even here, efforts were made. Armies employed camp followers, civilians, often women, who handled cooking, laundry, and even rudimentary medical care. Washing uniforms and underclothes was a major part of their labor. At times, makeshift bath areas were established near rivers, though these were not for leisure. They were survival measures, efforts to delay the spread of infection. In peacetime, religious institutions often bore the responsibility for public cleanliness. Monasteries and abbeys ran leprosaria, leper houses that maintained strict cleanliness rituals, both for spiritual and medical reasons. The rule of St. Benedict outlined specific times for washing hands and feet. Some monasteries even had primitive aqueducts, drainage systems, and designated washing areas, testament to a kind of proto-sanitation. Still, outbreaks of disease were common. Waterborne illnesses such as dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were often blamed on corrupted air, but the truth was simpler. Water sources were easily contaminated. Wells were placed too near latrines. Streams doubled as refuse dumps, and sewage was dumped into rivers that also served as drinking sources. And yet, out of this mess came innovation. By the late 14th century, some towns began experimenting with early sanitation infrastructure. London appointed its first official muckraker, an official tasked with clearing the streets of waste. In Milan, stone conduits carried fresh water into wealthier neighborhoods. In Lubeck, wooden gutters flushed dirty water into channels outside the city. Public fountains and washing basins were constructed, particularly in Italian city-states, where waterworks engineering advanced through contact with Byzantine and Arab innovations. Even the common peasant began to experience slow changes. Wooden rain barrels collected cleaner water. Clothing was increasingly boiled instead of scrubbed. Herbal knowledge spread, not just for flavoring food, but for making rudimentary soaps and washes. Small, incremental changes built a foundation for the more dramatic hygiene revolutions of the Enlightenment and industrial eras. By the 16th century, bathing began to reappear cautiously in wealthier circles. Private bath chambers were added to aristocratic homes. Servants were tasked with filling and emptying tubs. Imported soaps, perfumes, and oils, especially from the Islamic world, became fashionable. But even then, the old fear lingered. Queen Elizabeth I is rumored to have bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. The real transformation wouldn't come until the 18th and 19th centuries, with the rise of public health movements, germ theory, and indoor plumbing. But those advances were built atop centuries of dull, repetitive trial and error, hauling water, boiling linens, wiping down surfaces, and throwing herbs on a fire to mask the odor. So what do we learn from this slow, unglamorous march of hygiene history? Perhaps this: human survival is rarely heroic or flashy. More often, it's a long sequence of compromises and adaptations, dictated by environment, resources, and culture. The once-a-year bath wasn't about backwardness. It was about efficiency. It was about using what you had when you had it and making it last. And maybe, just maybe, that perspective offers us something valuable today. A reminder that cleanliness isn't just about purity or health or social status. It's about living within your means, with an awareness of your world, and doing what you can to be just a little more comfortable, a little more human in difficult times. So the next time you turn on your shower and let hot water cascade freely, consider this. Not so long ago, that same comfort took hours of labor, stacks of firewood, and a full family's coordination. And even then, you might be the fourth person to use the water. You live in a world without electricity. The sun sets and darkness follows. There's no ambient hum of LEDs, no flick of a switch to bring back the day. The night is full and absolute, broken only by fire, distant stars above, and, if you're fortunate, the warm flicker of a candle near your hearth. In 1300 AD, the candle was more than just a light source. It was a product of labor, knowledge, and scarcity. Candles were fragile torches of the home, the monastery, the workshop. And while they seem simple by today's standards, their creation was anything but. Understanding how a medieval candle was made tells us far more than how light was produced. It tells us how people thought, how they planned, and how they lived in sync with nature's limitations. Let us step into the shoes of a peasant, or, more likely, a monastic worker, tasked with the job of making candles for winter. The process was seasonal, dependent on livestock cycles, foraging, and trade routes. You would not simply decide to make a candle. You would prepare to make it across weeks or even months. There were two primary types of candles in medieval Europe: tallow candles made from animal fat and beeswax candles derived from honeycombs. The kind you used depended entirely on your status. Tallow candles were the poor man's light. Cheap, smoky, and smelly. They sputtered, gave off a yellow flame, and dripped constantly. But they could be made from the leftovers of slaughtered livestock, and that made them accessible, at least in small quantities. Beeswax candles, by contrast, were reserved for the wealthy and for churches. They burned cleaner, brighter, and longer, but beeswax was expensive, difficult to obtain in bulk, and often imported. In some regions, it was taxed or rationed. If you were preparing to make tallow candles, your year began with the autumn slaughter. Most villages could not afford to feed all their livestock through winter, so pigs, sheep, and cows were butchered in October or November. The suet, a hard fat from around the kidneys and loins, was collected and stored separately. This fat, once rendered down, will become the base of your candle. Rendering the fat involved melting it slowly over heat, skimming off impurities, and then allowing it to cool. The resulting tallow had to be poured through cloth or a fine sieve. The cleaner the tallow, the better the candle. Now, the smell, this was a problem. Tallow, even well rendered, smelled of animal. In the small confines of a thatched house, this odor lingered. Some tried to mask it by adding dried herbs like lavender, rosemary, or bay leaves during the rendering. But this was a luxury few could afford. If, however, you were working in a monastery, you likely had access to beeswax. This was collected from beehives, melted and strained. It required far less purification than tallow. Wax from hives was not wasted. Any leftovers from candles were saved and remelted into new forms. Some monasteries even kept their own apiaries for this purpose. But even the church faced shortages. Monasteries often purchased wax from merchants traveling from southern Europe or the Middle East, where apiculture was more advanced. Wax was so valuable, it was frequently stored in locked chests alongside gold and manuscripts. Once the tallow or wax was ready, attention turned to the wick, the heart of the candle. Today, wicks are chemically treated cotton, but in the 1300s, they were hand-spun, most often from flax or hemp fibers. Spinning was a task primarily assigned to women, and wick thread had to be tight, dry, and free from oils. Wicks were often braided for durability and dipped in molten tallow or wax before assembly. A good wick burned slowly and consistently. A bad wick smoked, curled, or collapsed into the candle base. In wealthier households or churches, wicks might be pre-soaked in salt water or lime to harden them. But again, this was an extra step, taken only when materials and labor were abundant. Here the real work began. In a tallow-based village candle-making setup, a series of wooden rods were suspended horizontally across two beams, or over a fire pit. Dozens of short wicks were tied onto each rod, hanging down like strands of string. A vat of melted tallow sat below. One by one, each wick was dipped, lowered into the tallow for a second or two, then raised. The layer of fat cooled and hardened. This process was repeated dozens of times. It was slow and meticulous. The candles built up like stalactites, layer by layer. The process was usually done outdoors in cool weather. Cold air helped the tallow set between dips. If it was too warm, the layers melted off. If too cold, the fat clumped. Each dip made the candle a little thicker. Beeswax candles, by contrast, were often poured into molds, hollowed tubes made of wood or horn. These molds were reusable and allowed for uniform shape. Churches sometimes used specially carved candle molds bearing their insignia or Latin inscriptions. In some cases, wax was even rolled into sheets around a wick, an innovation believed to have spread from the Islamic world. Freshly made candles were not used immediately. Tallow candles had to cure, or they would smoke and drip excessively. Makers hung them from rafters, beams, or poles for several days to harden. Storage was another challenge. Rodents loved tallow. Candles were stored in sealed boxes, high shelves, or suspended from ceiling beams and mesh nets. Beeswax candles were less at risk, but they too required dry, cool storage. And here, a fascinating practice emerged: candle rations. Households rationed candles carefully, often lighting only one or two per evening. A candle might be burned only for reading scripture or performing tasks by the hearth. Some families kept a Sunday candle for religious observation. Monasteries recorded candle usage in their ledgers down to the hour. Candle clocks were created. Candles marked with horizontal lines, each line signifying a 30-minute burn. For the poor, candles were rare. Many relied instead on rushlights, dried rush plants dipped in fat. These burned quickly and unevenly, but could be made in bulk at home. A single family might save up candle supplies for midwinter feasts, births, or funerals. So what did it mean to hold light in your hands in 1300 AD? It meant months of preparation, the rendering of fat, the work of women's hands spinning wicks, the boiling of vats, the careful rations. It meant the difference between darkness and sight, between scripture read aloud or whispered in memory. Candles were a kind of wealth, a stored energy. They symbolized warmth, knowledge, and time. But what of the church, the greatest consumer of light in medieval Europe? How did candles shape sacred rituals, social hierarchy, and the very architecture of faith? As night fell over medieval Europe, darkness wasn't simply the absence of light. It was a spiritual, psychological, and social frontier. And in the world of 1300 AD, candles were more than tools. They were symbols, they were currency, and above all, they were offerings. The church, sprawling, ornate, and intricately bound to the daily lives of the faithful, was a primary patron of candle-making in the Middle Ages. From the smallest chapel to the grandest cathedral, candles lit the path to the divine. Let's walk into a monastic church at dusk. You step inside and the air is cold, still. Stone walls rise high into darkness. The only illumination comes from beeswax candles, their flickering light dancing on gold altarpieces, reflecting in stained glass and flickering along long aisles. This isn't practical lighting. It's sacred. Every candle burns with meaning. In Christian thought, particularly post-Carolingian Europe, candles came to represent Christ as the light of the world. Lighting a candle was an act of prayer, of devotion, of offering. The flame was thought to rise heavenward, bearing one's petitions toward God. In some churches, worshippers left candles at the feet of saint statues. The size, purity, and location of your candle could say something about your social class or intentions. Beeswax, being clean burning and pleasant smelling, was believed to be the holiest material. Church doctrine even ascribed mystical significance to its purity. It was said that wax came from the virgin bee, and therefore symbolized the Virgin Mary. This belief, while biologically inaccurate, was widespread enough to influence purchasing practices. Tallow candles were often banned from high altars because they smoked and smelled like death. Instead, beeswax candles were reserved for Mass, for processions, and for use in relic chambers. The candle itself became a kind of votive object, a thing with both symbolic and economic value. Monasteries and cathedrals consumed staggering quantities of wax. The Abbey of Cluny, for example, is estimated to have burned hundreds of pounds of wax per year just for ordinary services. Major feast days, funerals, and coronations could consume dozens, if not hundreds, of large ceremonial candles in a single evening. But who made all these candles? In most cases, candles for religious use were made by guild-affiliated chandlers, professional candle makers. These guilds were powerful, often protected by charters from kings or bishops. In London, the Worshipful Company of Wax Chandlers received its first official recognition as early as the 14th century. Members had the exclusive right to produce and sell candles within city limits. Monasteries sometimes made their own, employing lay brothers to manage apiaries and rendering stations. But more often, wax was purchased through a system of feudal tribute. Serfs and landowners alike might owe wax dues, gifts of wax or completed candles, as part of their tithe. These dues were often collected at Candlemas, February 2nd, a feast day that marked the ritual blessing of candles for the year ahead. In effect, this created a wax economy, where entire villages contributed to the upkeep of sacred light. The cost of candles was reflected in church budgets, wills, and even court documents. Some people left candles in their wills, specifying that a 3-pound beeswax candle should burn for their soul during funeral rites. Others endowed churches with money to buy a year's worth of lighting, a kind of spiritual insurance policy. Outside the church, candles also signified wealth and power. Noble households employed servants to maintain elaborate lighting arrangements. In the great halls of castles, beeswax tapers were arranged for evening feasts, not merely for light, but to create ambience to impress guests. Candle holders were often made of bronze or iron, shaped like dragons, vines, or biblical scenes. The length and number of candles served as subtle indicators of a host's status. But even nobles rationed light. Wax was too valuable to waste. Servants might snuff out candles the moment guests left a room. Chandeliers could be lowered and raised via pulley systems to control access and minimize wax theft, a surprisingly common problem in large households. In merchant towns, street lighting was essentially non-existent. Travelers carried lanterns, small glass or horn containers enclosing candles, to navigate the night. Inns often posted candle hours. A single tallow candle would be issued per guest, expected to last the evening. In brothels and bathhouses, flickering candles provided privacy and mood, but were often kept in shallow bowls of water to catch wax and reduce fire risk. And then there were legal applications. Courtrooms and town halls used candles for both illumination and symbolism. A trial might begin with the lighting of candles and end with their extinguishing, signifying the close of judgment. In some regions, witnesses were sworn in by candlelight, and among some Scandinavian communities, law speakers carried candles during recitations of regional codes, a blending of oral tradition, fire, and memory. In times of war or siege, candles became even more vital. The flicker of light could mean a safe room, a guarded entrance, a vigil in progress, or it might signal a threat. Candlelight was visible from a great distance, and it could attract raiders or betray a hidden camp. As Europe entered the late Middle Ages, new innovations slowly crept in. Tallow began to be purified with alkaline salts. Molds became more sophisticated. Wicks were braided tighter, leading to self-trimming designs that didn't need to be snuffed or relit as often. And yet, the basic reality remained. Light was labor, and candles were painstaking to make, expensive to burn, and never taken for granted. Which raises a curious thought. How did the ordinary, rural family manage in this world of expensive wax and sacred light? What were the everyday alternatives to candles? And how did people balance the fear of fire with the necessity of seeing after sundown? By now, we've seen how candles illuminated the sacred halls of cathedrals and the feasting tables of nobility. But for the vast majority of people in 1300 A.D., farmers, craftsmen, widows, millers, and shepherds, the relationship to light was defined not by abundance, but by restriction. Candles, especially beeswax ones, were almost never burned casually in a peasant home. They were expensive, difficult to make, and highly valued. So what did the common folk do when the sun dipped below the horizon? They adapted, as people always do. First and foremost, the rural working class lived according to natural light cycles. Sunrise marked the beginning of labor. Sunset marked its end. Artificial lighting was not something to be relied upon, but something to be rationed. A candle was burned deliberately, not for ambience, not even for comfort, but because it was needed. Evening hours were short and filled with small tasks: mending clothes, repairing tools, eating a humble dinner by the hearth. People spoke of burning a candle at both ends, not as a metaphor for overwork, but as a real and reckless waste of precious fuel. When candles were burned in rural homes, they were almost always tallow-based and often homemade. Families collected animal fat from their own butchered pigs or sheep, rendered it slowly over an open fire, and made rough candles by dipping reeds or hand-twisted wicks. The smell was unpleasant. The light was dim. The smoke was thick. But it worked barely. Yet even tallow was sometimes out of reach. In these cases, People turned to rushlights, the humble substitute for candles across much of northern Europe. Rushes, common plants growing in wet meadows, were gathered, peeled, and dried. The pithy inner core was then soaked in melted fat or grease and left to harden. Once lit, a rushlight would burn with a low, fast flame, often lasting only 15 to 20 minutes. They were typically held in iron clamps or rushlight holders, simple devices with weighted bases. Some had adjustable jaws to grip the rush at an angle, allowing better control of the burn rate. The flame sputtered. It dripped. It blackened the walls. But it provided enough light to stir a pot, say a prayer, or check on a sleeping child. Other light sources included firewood and hearth coals, often kept smoldering overnight. The hearth wasn't just a cooking place. It was a center of domestic life. Its faint orange glow was used for navigation, storytelling, and warmth. A well-managed fire could be banked with ashes to preserve embers through the night, saving both fuel and labor. In wealthier peasant homes or small village inns, oil lamps, burning animal or vegetable oils, might be found. But these were rare, delicate, and often poorly made. They spilled, smoked, and produced little light. No matter the method, fire was always a threat. Medieval houses were flammable, thatched roofs, wooden beams, rush floors. A single candle left unattended could destroy an entire village. Fire was a necessary evil. Used cautiously, watched constantly. Children were taught strict fire discipline from a young age. Candle holders were weighted or wall-mounted to prevent tipping. Some households used water bowls beneath burning candles to catch wax and sparks. Many communities developed unwritten rules. Candles were only lit near stone hearths, or only burned during communal meals, when multiple eyes could watch. Despite these precautions, fires were common. Town records from the 14th and 15th centuries are littered with references to accidental house fires, often caused by candles or lanterns. The spread of fire through thatched towns was rapid and devastating. After several fires, London banned thatched roofing altogether in the 13th century. Candles weren't just used to see, they were used to tell time. The candle clock was a crude but clever tool. A long candle, typically of uniform thickness, was marked with horizontal lines. Each line might represent 30 minutes or an hour. As the candle burned down past each mark, people would track time. Monasteries used this method to regulate prayers, especially during the night hours of matins and lauds. Even among villagers, the idea of one candle's worth of time became a standard unit, roughly 2 to 3 hours for a well-made taper. These habits reflected a world in which time was not measured in seconds or minutes, but in physical consumption. Time, quite literally, burned away. Light was not just practical, it was psychological. In winter, days were short, nights long. For communities above the 50th parallel, like much of Britain or Scandinavia, the darkness could last 16 to 18 hours. People coped with storytelling, singing, weaving, mending, or simply sitting near the fire. But light was also communal. A single candle might serve several people. Families gathered close together to share warmth and illumination. This closeness influenced the architecture of homes. Small windows, low ceilings, central hearths. Light dictated proximity. And on special occasions, light became celebratory. During weddings, funerals, and feast days, households might burn extra candles or hang lanterns outside the home. On Candlemas, candles were blessed and carried in procession. On All Hallows' Eve, small lanterns lit the path for visiting spirits, or so the story said. Candles could also mark major transitions: a birth, a death, a journey. A traveler setting out before dawn might be given a candle, not just to light his path, but as a symbol of hope, prayer, and safe return. As the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, changes began to stir. Trade expanded. Soap making became industrialized. New candle materials, like spermaceti from whale oil, were introduced. Innovations in molding, wick braiding, and oil distillation improved quality and longevity. By the 18th century, candles were no longer handmade by most peasants. They were purchased. But in 1300 AD, every candle still told a story of labor, of necessity, of faith, a story of light bought with blood, sweat, and suet. It's easy to take light for granted today. But when you pause and watch a flame flicker, remember, for hundreds of years, that flicker was the only certainty in the dark. It was warmth. It was time. It was the difference between hope and fear. Before the printing press, before the typewriter, before the quiet clatter of modern keyboards, writing was labor, intimate, visible, and deeply tied to status and survival. In ancient Rome, literacy was a privilege. Writing was a public performance. And in the heart of that performance stood a figure both vital and largely forgotten, the public scribe or scriba. Let us descend into the Roman Forum. Somewhere between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE, the sun bakes the stone pavement. Traders bark prices. Magistrates march in procession. But to one side, beneath the shade of a colonnade, sit men with wax tablets, ink pots, styluses, and an air of quiet diligence. These are the scribae, and for a few coins, they can give your thoughts the permanence of parchment. But who were these men? They were not poets. They were not politicians. Nor were they lowly peasants. Public scribes occupied a liminal space in Roman society. Neither elite nor poor, neither slave nor free in all cases. Some were freedmen, former slaves who had gained their independence and now made a living through literacy. Others were born free, educated enough to serve in bureaucratic roles, but not wealthy enough to escape labor. In Rome, literacy was not universal. Estimates vary, but most scholars suggest that perhaps 10 to 20% of the Roman population could read or write at a functional level. Even fewer could compose formal documents. Writing was a craft, and like all crafts in the Roman world, it was organized, trained, and performed in public. The scribe's day began early. In summer, the forum buzzed at dawn, before the heat became unbearable. Scribes set up their stations, simple stools, folding tables, and sometimes wooden boxes containing tools. Their work was highly visible, often loud, and necessarily mobile. Rain or extreme heat might force them indoors, but on most days, they stayed where the crowds were. Their clients ranged widely. A poor widow dictating a petition to a magistrate, a merchant requesting a contract to be drawn up, a soldier wanting to send a letter home, a father disinheriting a son, a client recording a will or manumission of a slave. Some scribes specialize in legal writing, crafting contracts, wills, or formal complaints. Others focus on personal correspondence, translating the spoken word into elegant written Latin or Greek. Multilingualism was common. Rome was a city of traders, immigrants, and provincial visitors. The tools of the public scribe were humble but essential. Wax tablets, tabulae serrae, reusable wooden boards filled with dark wax. Writing on them was done with a stylus, one end pointed for carving, the other flat for smoothing. These were ideal for drafts, notes, or short-term messages. Papyrus scrolls for more permanent documents. Expensive, fragile, and imported from Egypt, papyrus was reserved for formal letters, contracts, and records. Ink and stylus pens. Calami ink was made from soot, gum, and water, sometimes mixed with wine or vinegar to improve flow. Quills were not yet in use. Instead, reed pens were cut and shaped to deliver a steady stream of ink. Seals and ribbons. Official documents required sealing, usually with wax or lead. The client's signet ring would be pressed into soft wax to prove authenticity. Mistakes could be costly, especially in legal writing. A wrongly phrased will, a misnamed citizen, a mistranslated clause could result in lawsuits or invalidated agreements. Some scribes carried copies of Roman law codes or official forms to reduce the risk of error. The role of the scribe came with a curious kind of respect. On one hand, scribes were seen as necessary intermediaries. They gave voice to the illiterate, power to the common man. On the other, they were often viewed with suspicion. Scribes could be bribed. They might alter documents. They knew your secrets and your debts. The historian Pliny the Younger once wrote dismissively of scribes who styled themselves as philosophers of the pen, mocking their pretensions. Yet the very fact that scribes were so visible in Roman satire and literature shows their ubiquity. Some scribes rose to prominence. A freedman named Tiro, one secretary to Cicero, became famous for developing Tyronian notes, an early shorthand system. Others were attached to senatorial offices, tax agencies, or imperial archives, where writing became less about public dictation and more about managing the machinery of empire. Even so, most scribes worked without titles or fanfare. They dealt with the daily detritus of Roman life: debts, land disputes, unpaid taxes, marriage contracts, runaway slaves. For a few coins, they granted permanence to grievances and dreams alike. Why did more people learn to write? The answer lies partly in cost. Education in Rome required time, money, and social support. Boys, and occasionally girls in elite households, might attend primary school ludus, then move to grammar school. But schooling was not free, and many families needed children to work. For those who could read, writing was often a secondary skill, unnecessary for daily function. So scribes filled the gap, monetizing the chasm between oral and written worlds. In a sense, they acted as a memory and record keepers of Rome. They transcribed accusations and confessions, oaths and declarations, hopes and curses. They were paid by the word, the line, or the page, depending on the job. And yet, their existence raises a question. What did it feel like to write for a society that couldn't read? To serve people who entrusted you with their only bridge to the state? As we move into Section 2, we'll follow a scribe beyond the forum, into the offices of empire, the dusty archives of power, and the slow professionalization of writing as a Roman career. In the bustling public spaces of Rome, the scribe was a tradesman, visible, approachable, and paid in coin or kind. But behind the marble columns and inside the shaded administrative halls of the empire, the role of the scribe changed. Here, scribes became bureaucrats, essential to the maintenance of a system so vast that it spanned continents and centuries. To write in the name of Rome was to carry the weight of law, order, and power. And many scribes found themselves not at tables in the forum, but within the machinery of state, copying tax records, military rolls, court proceedings, and senatorial decrees. In the Roman bureaucracy, scribes weren't freelancers. They were civil servants. The scribi were part of an organized corps of record keepers assigned to specific magistrates, such as quaestors, financial officers, aediles, public works, or praetors, judicial authorities. This official role brought a level of security and hierarchy absent from the open-air scribes of the forum. Each magistrate typically had a staff officium, composed of multiple levels. Scribi, professional scribes responsible for documentation. Notarii, note-takers and shorthand experts. Actuarii, clerks who drafted and copied proceedings. Archivarii, archivists managing state records. These positions were highly sought after, often held by freedmen who, while barred from high political office, could still climb the social ladder through bureaucratic excellence. And these jobs were not short-term. A quaestor, for instance, might only serve a one-year term, but a scribe could remain in place for decades. This continuity made them powerful. They were the institutional memory of Rome's administrative state. Inside Roman government buildings, offices, temples, and record halls, the scribes worked under pressure, but not under the sun. Here, work was slower, more deliberate. Scribes wrote in longhand on papyrus rolls, which were stored in scroll libraries, tabularia, bound in leather or linen. Imagine the tabularium, the official records office of Rome, located at the foot of Capitoline Hill, dimly lit by oil lamps. Its shelves held scrolls documenting every decree, court ruling, and census from across the republic and empire. Scribes here were not only writing, they were indexing, summarizing, and cross-referencing. Accuracy was paramount. Errors in tax assessments, land boundaries, or military rosters could lead to disputes, uprisings, or misallocation of resources. To prevent mistakes, scribes used templates for standard contracts and legal forms, abbreviations and shorthand systems, including Tyronian notes, multiple drafts of important documents before a final scroll was sealed. This work could be monotonous, but it was also powerful. Scribes had access to the private affairs of citizens, provinces, and senators. They knew who owed what, who was dying without heirs, who was sending grain from Egypt or wine from Gaul. In a society obsessed with lineage, contracts, and land, writing meant control. How did one become a government scribe? The path usually began in education, particularly grammar schools. For those who could afford it, advanced training included rhetoric, logic, and handwriting. Literacy alone wasn't enough. One needed speed, clarity, and composure under pressure, skills taught in workshops or passed down in families of professional scribes. After training, young scribes might begin as copyists, transcribing existing documents. Over time, they could rise to more responsible roles, drafting letters, recording court minutes, or even writing imperial edicts. By the High Empire, 1st to 2nd century CE, the imperial bureaucracy had grown so large that scribes were divided into departments, such as a epistulus, responsible for drafting the emperor's correspondence; a rationibus managed imperial finances; a libellus processed petitions to the emperor. Each department had dozens of scribes and clerks. Some were imperial freedmen, trusted because they owed their status to the emperor. Others were slaves, literate and highly trained, whose loyalty was enforced through threat and reward. Over time, the most trusted scribes became confidants, their pens shaping imperial policy. A few rose far beyond their station. Gaius Julius Hyginus, a freedman under Augustus, became head of the Palatine Library. Others amassed wealth, influence, and familial connections that allowed their descendants to enter politics. Still, these were exceptions. Most scribes led quiet lives in the service of routine. What exactly did a bureaucratic scribe write? Census forms, updated every 5 years, listing names, property, livestock, and family members. Tax rolls, detailing how much each landowner owed, when and in what form, grain, coin, labor. Military assignments, tracking legions, promotions, leave requests, and discharge notices. Court proceedings, including complaints, judgments, punishments, and appeals. Provincial reports, sent from governors to the capital, often in triplicate. Each of these required precision and neutrality. A scribe did not advocate. He recorded. He was the voice of bureaucracy, not emotion. Mistakes could mean death, property seizure, or military desertion. And all was done by hand, slowly, carefully, with a reed pen and ink that might smudge if one's hand shook or the weather turned humid. Imagine doing this day after day, in a room filled with scratching pens and whispering voices. Imagine copying a 200-line decree for the 6th time, with no room for error. Imagine knowing that somewhere, far across the sea in a Gallic village or Egyptian port, a centurion or a magistrate would enforce your handwriting as law. As the empire aged, the scribe's world changed. The volume of documents grew, the weight of the bureaucracy increased, and the system began to strain. Corruption seeped in. Scribes sometimes sold information, falsified documents, or altered wills for a price. Forgery became a crime punishable by mutilation or death. Yet through it all, the scribe endured, because Rome could not function without him. He was invisible but indispensable, silent but central. He did not shape history with the sword or the Senate floor, but he preserved it. Without the scribes, we would know almost nothing of Roman law, daily life, or imperial ambition. And yet, that raises a final question. What happened to these records and to the scribes themselves when Rome began to crumble? What does it mean to write for eternity in a world on the brink of collapse? When the Roman Empire began its slow, grinding decline in the 3rd and 4th century CE, it did not collapse with a single fall. It decomposed bureaucratically, socially, militarily. And as emperors rose and fell, cities were sacked and provinces splintered, the role of the scribe, quiet, steady, bureaucratic, began to shift into something even more complex. Part civil servant, part preserver, part survivor. At first, the scribes adapted. They always had. Even as Gothic invasions swept across the western provinces and economic stability faltered, record-keeping remained a necessity. Taxes still needed collecting. Laws still needed copying. And soldiers, whether Roman or Federati mercenaries, still needed to be paid. But beneath the surface, the infrastructure was rotting. In Rome's early centuries, the tabularium, municipal archives, temple records, and provincial offices stored vast scrolls of legal, military, and economic data. Scrolls were organized, updated, and copied as papyrus decayed. But by the late 4th century, record loss became endemic. Fires, both accidental and deliberate, destroyed archives. Neglect, as scribes fled or died without successors, left documents uncopied. War, particularly the sackings of Rome in 410 CE by the Visigoths and 455 CE by the Vandals, obliterated administrative continuity. In provincial towns, scribes often became the last literate individuals, especially as formal schooling waned. They acted as notaries, clerks, teachers, even local judges. But they were now guardians of a fading order. The documents they copied weren't always enforced. The laws they wrote down were increasingly ignored. Still, they kept writing. In regions like North Africa and Gaul, scribes preserved legal codes such as a Codex Theodosianus. In the East, under the later Byzantine Empire, scribes helped compile the Corpus Juris Civilis under Justinian, what would later be known as the Justinian Code, forming the backbone of much of Western legal tradition. But even as some texts were enshrined, others were lost permanently. Entire categories of Roman bureaucratic records vanished. Census rolls, personal contracts, land registries. These were not destroyed by fire or conquest alone. They were erased by irrelevance. As centralized authority dissolved, who cared who owned what, who collected what taxes, who enforced what judgments? The pen had not failed. The system had. In the vacuum left behind, a new figure began to rise, the Christian scribe. While state scribes dwindled in number, monasteries began collecting and copying not tax documents, but religious texts. Monks trained in scriptoria, quiet, laborious writing rooms, began transcribing the Gospels, Psalms, and eventually classical Roman works that survived by virtue of being bound with Christian thought. Ironically, the public scribe, once a secular tradesman, became the ancestor of the monastic copyist. The function remained, to preserve thought, formalize speech, and make memory permanent. But the purpose had shifted, from law to theology, from commerce to faith, from state power to spiritual permanence. Still, the techniques remain the same: ink, reed, pens, parchment. In fact, some monastic scribes inherited scrolls and techniques directly from fallen Roman offices. Even the script evolved slowly. The tidy Roman Capitolese quadrata gave way to uncial and later Carolingian minuscule, the latter forming the basis of modern lowercase letters. What is the legacy of the Roman scribe? He is largely invisible to us. His name is rarely remembered, but without him, there would be no Rome to study. It was a scribe who wrote down the land deeds, contracts, and laws that modern archaeologists uncover. It was a scribe who copied Caesar's accounts, Cicero's letters, and the records of Roman roads. It was a scribe who transcribed the grain shipments that fed millions and the laws that governed them. Occasionally, we get glimpses, notes left in margins. I wrote this with a cold hand. Thank God this scroll is finished. Let no one correct this work unless he is better. These scribes were not faceless automatons. They were men, sometimes women, who faced boredom, pressure, and fatigue. They got blisters, ink-stained fingers, and blurred vision. They made mistakes. They corrected them. They complained. They kept going. When Rome fell, its scribes didn't vanish. They evolved. Their pen survived in monasteries, chancelleries, and eventually in the hands of Renaissance scholars who would rediscover the past they had helped preserve. Today, when you read a translated letter from a Roman official, or marvel at a stone inscription faithfully copied from an ancient edict, or even glance at legal principles rooted in Roman thought, you are not just witnessing the voice of emperors or generals. You are witnessing the hand of the scribe. And as we turn our attention from the ink-stained benches of the Roman Forum to the kitchens, fields, and stomachs of the early modern world, we'll discover that survival often came not from parchment, but from mud, roots, and bitter leaves. You wake up not to the aroma of baking bread or stew bubbling over a hearth, but to the ache of an empty stomach. Your children are crying softly in the corner, curled beneath a damp wool blanket. The weather has turned cold again, and the snow outside is mottled with mud. You listen for the sounds of neighbors. Sometimes silence is worse than shouting. It means they've already gone out to scavenge. It is 1741, and you are living through one of Europe's many forgotten famines. Famine is often remembered in dramatic, catastrophic moments. The Irish potato famine, the Bengal famine, the Great Chinese famine. But between those massive, headline-making tragedies were dozens, hundreds of smaller famines, slow-moving disasters that unfolded across villages, valleys, and provinces. The 18th century, especially in rural Europe, was punctuated by these crises. And when there was no food, people turned to what they could find, including dirt. Most rural families in the 1700s lived harvest to harvest. A bad season, too much rain, too little sun, a late frost could destroy barley, rye, wheat, or oats, depending on the region. In years of failed crops, bread, already a thin and precious commodity for the poor, disappeared entirely. Even in good years, bread might be stretch bread, loaves padded with sawdust, ground straw, or mill bark. In bad years, these additives became the bulk of the meal. In France, between 1693 and 1740, recurring harvest failures led to waves of substitute eating, a desperate culinary tradition built not on flavor, but on survival. Similar stories come from Scotland, Norway, the Russian countryside, and Prussian states. So, what did people eat when food ran out? In Scandinavia and parts of Eastern Europe, tree bark, particularly from pine and birch, was harvested for flour. The inner layer, called a cambium, was scraped, dried, and ground into a fibrous powder. It was then mixed with rye flour, if any remained, and water to make flatbread. Taste: bitter, woody, hard to digest. Effect: weak nutrition, but some calories. Problem: overharvesting bark killed trees, leading to further environmental stress. In various regions, including parts of France, the Alps, and occasionally West Africa, people consume kaolin-rich clay, or earth mixed with water and fat, if available. The practice, known today as geophagy, often began with children who instinctively chewed dirt to quiet hunger pangs. Purpose: not nourishment, but stomach filling. Side effects: constipation, nutrient malabsorption, and sometimes death from intestinal blockages or toxic soil. Records: French parish notes from 1709 describe children made of earth more than bone. In the Highlands of Scotland during the 1740 to 1742 famine, women gathered nettle, dock, dandelion, and thistle roots, boiling them into watery stews. These plants offered trace vitamins but required long cooking to soften. Flavor: metallic and sour. Danger: mistaking poisonous plants like hemlock or deadly nightshade. Adaptation: families passed down recipes for safe stews using generational plant knowledge. In cities under siege or in isolated hamlets, desperate people turned to boiled animal hides, leather belts, or even dead animals found in the street. Example: in 1709, during the Great Frost that gripped Europe, Parisian reports describe residents boiling shoelaces and dog skin. Nutritional value: almost none gelatin and trace protein. Risk: spoilage and disease transmission. Lichen, scraped from rocks and boiled, became a famine staple in Lapland and Siberia. Even Napoleon's retreating troops in 1812 reportedly survived on mossy gruel. Preparation: multiple boils to remove bitterness. Benefit: trace carbohydrates and fiber. Limitation: not enough to sustain human energy levels long term. Hunger didn't just erode the body, it rewrote morality. In times of famine, theft became common. Fields were raided before harvest. Church grain stores were broken into. Priests begged for calm from the pulpit while hiding their own food supplies. Neighbors accused one another of hoarding, or worse, witchcraft, believed by some to be responsible for blighting the crops. Cannibalism, while rare, was not entirely unheard of. In eastern Prussia and remote Russian settlements, there are scattered reports, some first-hand, some sensationalized, of families consuming the dead. More often, however, the line was drawn just shy of that horror. Instead, hunger reshaped class structures. The wealthy could import grain or meat. The poor, without land or savings, ate weeds, bark, and inedible things. Parish records, military enlistments, and hospital logs from the time all showed the same thing: malnutrition, stunted growth, and spikes in infant mortality. And all of it was considered normal, a part of life. For rural Europeans, the rhythm of hunger was seasonal. There was a green hunger of early spring, before crops came in, the lean months after winter, the breadless weeks before the harvest. Everyone knew them, everyone prepared. But no one was ever truly ready. And when local famine was met with state indifference, what happened next? What did governments do or fail to do when their people were eating bark and dirt? In the 18th century, famine was not just a natural disaster. It was a political and economic one. Droughts and crop failures may have sparked a fire, but it was a systemic indifference of ruling classes, the rigidity of trade laws, and the stubborn devotion to outdated feudal systems that allowed hunger to spread like a slow-moving plague. When you are starving, it is not the absence of food that breaks you. It is the knowledge that food still exists, locked away in storehouses, bound up in contracts, or priced far beyond your reach. And in 18th century Europe, food existed. It simply wasn't accessible. In France, for instance, grain was not just a staple. It was a commodity, a unit of wealth and speculation. Landowners and merchants hoarded grain during shortages, waiting for prices to rise. The free grain trade system introduced under Louis XV allowed grain to be sold to the highest bidder, even if that meant shipping it to other regions or countries while local populations starved. The monarchy believed this would stabilize supply over time, trusting that the invisible hand of the market would balance scarcity. In reality, it created spikes of inflation, panic buying, and ultimately, bread riots. Poor families who had once relied on local grain mills now watched carts loaded with sacks of rye and wheat roll past their villages, on their way to richer towns or export docks. During the famine of 1740 to 1741, which killed over 400,000 people in France and Ireland combined, parish priests recorded sermons pleading with grain merchants to open their stores. Sometimes they were ignored. Other times they were forcibly silenced. In Ireland, the problem was worse. The majority of Irish land was controlled by Anglo-Irish landlords, many of whom lived in England. Rents were collected in cash or kind, and when famine struck in the early 1740s, many tenants still had to pay, even if they had sold everything, even if they were already starving. Evictions were common. So was death. There were efforts to help, but they were often too little, too late. In France, the monarchy occasionally opened royal grain stores, but bureaucratic delays, corruption, and poor transport meant that food rarely reached the most desperate areas. Royal edicts against hoarding were hard to enforce, especially when local lords were the hoarders themselves. In Prussia, Frederick the Great implemented a more modern approach. He invested in granaries, established emergency bread kitchens, and even ordered the planting of potatoes, then a foreign and distrusted crop, as a famine hedge. His policies were met with resistance, but ultimately saved lives. To this day, he is credited with introducing potatoes as a staple of Northern European diets. In Britain, responses to famine in Ireland and Scotland were often tinged with classism and racism. Some English commentators blamed the Irish poor for their own hunger, calling them lazy or ignorant. Aid was limited, sporadic, and dependent on local charity, not national policy. Relief efforts often require recipients to perform labor, building roads, draining bogs, while starving. But more often than not, rulers prioritized order over nourishment. Their greatest fear wasn't hunger, it was rebellion. Starvation rarely remained passive. By the 18th century, bread was no longer just a food. It was a symbol of survival, deeply embedded in religious, cultural, and moral expectations. The concept of the moral economy prevailed. The belief that rulers had a duty to ensure subsistence for their subjects, even if that meant regulating markets or intervening in trade. So when the people went hungry, they did not always suffer silently. Bread riots erupted in dozens of cities. These were not always chaotic mobs. Often, they were highly organized, led by women, local priests, or workers. Rioters broke into bakeries, seized carts of flour, or forced merchants to sell grain at just prices, threatening violence only if refused. These actions were seen not as criminal, but moral enforcement, upholding the unwritten contract between ruler and ruled. In Lyon, 1740, hungry weavers looted warehouses and distributed flour among neighbors. In Dijon, crowds marched with empty sacks, demanding them to be filled. In County Kerry, Irish peasants blockaded roads, turning back shipments of grain meant for export. Authorities responded with force. Troops were dispatched, ringleaders arrested or executed, and public notices warned against interfering with the lawful movement of goods. Yet for every crackdown, more people joined the cause. Hunger made ideology irrelevant. Starvation made law optional. While governments floundered, private charity, especially from religious institutions, became the only dependable lifeline for many. Churches and monasteries ran soup kitchens centuries before the term existed, boiling thin broth of peas, onions, and roots to serve hundreds. Parishes organized collection drives, encouraging the less impoverished to donate food, firewood, or clothing. In some regions, they set up grain banks, communally managed stores where villagers could withdraw food in lean times and repay in better years. Still, even charity had limits. Churches were often poor themselves, their coffers drained by years of supporting famine-struck congregations. Many priests died alongside their parishioners, sharing what little they had. And yet, in the pages of their records, baptism books, death rolls, donation logs, we see the shape of what survival looked like: a handful of beans, a sack of oats, a shared pot of soup. In the quiet corners of failing systems, human resilience flickered. Famine was more than temporary suffering. It transformed entire cultures. It changed dietary habits, forcing people to adapt to new crops. The potato, once viewed with suspicion, became a cornerstone food in Prussia, Ireland, and Poland. It altered property structures, as land passed from the dead to living, often consolidating into larger estates. It weakened faith in monarchs, sowing the seeds of revolution in France and unrest in Ireland. It redefined the idea of state responsibility. In the wake of repeated famines, more European governments began to formalize relief efforts, laying the groundwork for the modern welfare state. But for those living through it, change was abstract. Hunger was immediate. And when famine became unbearable, some made the ultimate decision to leave, to walk away from the land, the soil, the graves of family, and start again elsewhere. But where did they go? How did famine drive waves of migration that reshaped continents in the century to follow? Famine does not just kill. It moves people. When the land no longer yields, when leaders fail to act, and when even bark and clay can't sustain the body, the only option left is to walk. And so, from the muddy fields of western France to the wind-scoured glens of Scotland, from the bog of Ireland to the frostbitten reaches of Poland, famine in the 18th century became the first spark in a fire of mass migration that would define the modern world. This was not the epic, cinematic exodus of history books. This was slow, desperate, anonymous movement of families, widows, apprentices, ex-soldiers, and tenant farmers, moving not toward dreams, but simply away from hunger. Most famine-driven migration was regional, not transcontinental. Families left rural villages for nearby towns, or moved from one valley to another in search of better soil, looser landlords, or nearby kin who had just enough food to share. But these migrations often created new strains on host communities. In Ireland, where rural families were forced off small plots by starvation or eviction, small market towns saw their populations swell beyond capacity. In France, vagrancy laws were passed to discourage the wandering poor from settling in areas already on the brink of collapse. And yet, the pressure did not stop. By the mid-18th century, state documents, parish records, and personal letters speak of strangers in lanes, widows with no parish, and poor children living in ditches. These were people dislodged by hunger, no longer villagers, not yet anything else. As Europe's cities slowly industrialized, many famine-displaced people became the first wave of laborers to fill the early factories, foundries, and textile mills. In Manchester, orphaned Irish children appeared on the census rolls as early as 1750. In Lille and Rouen, French peasants displaced by crop failures formed the core of early weaving districts. In Berlin, Prussian programs encouraged the settlement of famine refugees in newly open frontier lands. These people did not migrate for opportunity. They migrated for calories. And in doing so, they transformed the very nature of poverty. No longer confined to rural farms or tied to seasonal labor, the poor became a floating class, dependent on wages, crowded into damp tenements, and tied to bread lines and soup kitchens instead of communal fields. It is no coincidence that modern capitalism began to rise alongside mass urban hunger. Famine provided the labor, even as it drained the land. For some, especially by the end of the 18th century, regional migration was not enough. Hunger drove them across oceans. The first significant waves of transatlantic migration linked directly to famine began during and after the 1740 to 1741 disasters. From Ulster and Western Ireland, families boarded ships bound for Newfoundland, the Caribbean, and the American colonies. French peasants, often from Normandy and Brittany, traveled to New France, Canada, or the West Indies. German-speaking regions affected by famines and economic instability, particularly in Palatinate and Swabia, sent families toward Pennsylvania and New York, forming the early roots of what would become Pennsylvania Dutch communities. These voyages were not glamorous. They were often debt-ridden, undertaken as indentured labor. Poor migrants signed away for the 7 years of freedom for the promise of land or wages abroad. Ship conditions were appalling. Famine didn't end at the dock. It followed them on board. Diseases like dysentery, scurvy, and typhus killed many before they even saw land. But those who survived planted new communities, ones defined not by ambition but by survival experience. These were families who knew how to make nettle soup, who had eaten bark, who had buried infants in frozen ground. And in that grim familiarity, they carried forward a culture of resilience, thrift, and adaptation that shaped early settler societies. What happens to people who have eaten dirt? They remember. Even generations later, the trauma of famine persisted. Not always in open conversation, but in habits, recipes, and rituals. In Ireland, generations after the 1740s and later the Great Famine, children were still warned, don't waste a potato. In Scandinavia, bark bread was recreated during World War II, not from necessity but from folk memory, a reminder that it had once kept people alive. In Germany and Eastern Europe, dishes like gruel, black bread, and sour soup became traditional, even celebratory, massing origins and famine with the polish of heritage. Famine foods, once symbols of desperation, became cultural markers both honored and feared. The 18th century famines may not have made global headlines had headlines existed, but they left fingerprints everywhere. In language, words for famine crept into proverbs, lullabies, and curses. In law, cities revised poor relief policies, established soup kitchens, created grain banks. In religion, hunger was interpreted as divine punishment or conversely, as a test of mercy. In economics, crop insurance, price regulation, and early welfare systems began to appear. But most importantly, famine redefined what it meant to live close to the edge. It made clear that survival was not guaranteed, that soil could betray you, that kings might ignore you, that bread could vanish, and with it, the social fabric that held everything together. And that legacy lingered. Because even after the bark was gone, the roots boiled and the clay cakes abandoned, the memory of what people once ate and what they once endured never left the land. Imagine a letter, nothing more than a few inches of papyrus or birch bark, sealed with wax, stamped with the Great Khan sign. This letter, however, will travel over 4,000 miles, across desert, steppe, mountain, and river, passing through dozens of hands in as little as 2 weeks. And all of this, centuries before the railroad, long before the telegraph, and long, long before airmail. You are now entering the world of the yam, the sprawling, invisible network of postal relay stations that formed the circulatory system of the Mongol Empire. While the name of Genghis Khan is often associated with war, conquest, and scorched earth, the yam stands as a quieter marvel, a logistical achievement so advanced that it rivaled anything in the ancient or medieval world. And yet, most people today have never heard of it. The yam, or two, was a relay system of mounted couriers and way stations stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the heart of Eastern Europe. It was established in the early 13th century by Genghis Khan and expanded under his descendants, Ogedai, Monk, and Kublai, eventually forming a system that spanned the largest contiguous land empire in human history. At its peak, the yam featured more than 1,400 relay stations. Estimates vary. A fresh horse and rider every 25 to 40 kilometers. emergency supplies, food, yurts, and guards at each station. A system of pesa, metal passports or medallions, granting messengers and officials the right to demand assistance and lodging along the route. In short, the Yam allowed imperial messengers to travel 250 to 300 kilometers per day, nearly 5 to 10 times the speed of a merchant caravan. That is faster than many pre-modern armies could march. This network was not just about letters. It was the nervous system of empire, carrying decrees from the Khan, military dispatches, tax records, trade information, religious correspondence, and even scientific knowledge, as Mongol rulers corresponded with astrologers, doctors, and engineers from Baghdad to Beijing. Let's follow a courier, let's call him Batar, on a mission from Karakorum, the Mongol capital in present-day Mongolia, to Samarkand in Central Asia. Batar is not a soldier. He is lean, fast, and disciplined. He carries a sealed pouch of letters, protected from weather, dust, and thieves. On his belt hangs his pesa, a metal tablet stamped with the Khan seal, granting him access to food, shelter, fresh horses, and protection. Each day, Batar rides between 2 and 4 relay stations, switching horses at each one. He does not linger. The stations, or tugs, are staffed by locals who are required to maintain a supply of horses, fodder, and lodging. These caretakers are part of the imperial support system. Some are volunteers, others are conscripts, and all are legally bound to support the Yam. Horses are kept in corrals, small and agile steppe ponies bred for endurance, not speed. Upon arrival, Batar hands his tired horse to the stable master, takes a fresh one, and is on his way again in minutes. At night, he sleeps in a yurt provided by the station, eats dried meat, drinks fermented mare's milk arag, and checks his satchel for damage. He is expected to cover over 2,000 miles in less than 20 days. And remarkably, he often does. None of this was accidental. Genghis Khan understood that conquest was not enough. To hold an empire, he needed information, fast, accurate, and controlled. The Yam was not only a postal system, it was a tool of central authority. Messages from distant governors could reach the Khan in days instead of months. Rebellions could be reported, weather disasters anticipated, enemies tracked. Orders could be dispatched with unprecedented speed, allowing for flexible military response across multiple fronts. The Mongols did not invent the idea of a courier system. The Persians had the Angarium, the Romans had the cursus publicus, and the Chinese had an imperial post as early as the Han dynasty. But the Mongols perfected it, merging military, administrative, and cultural needs into a seamless operation. In fact, it was the integration of these systems that made the Yam so effective. When the Mongols conquered northern China, they absorbed Chinese courier models. When they subdued Persia, they revived Silk Road routes and repaired roads. In Russia, they built new roads across the frozen steppes, extending the Yam deep into Slavic territory. This network served not just the Mongols, but also traders, envoys, pilgrims, and spies. It became the backbone of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, that allowed merchants to travel from Venice to Beijing under one banner. Maintaining such a network came at a price. The burden of supporting the Yam often fell on local populations. Nomadic tribes, farmers, and towns were required to provide horses, food, and labor. In peaceful times, this was an honor. In times of scarcity or war, it became a heavy tax. Horses were valuable, critical for farming, war, and trade. When the Yam demanded horses, families sometimes went without. In border areas or recently conquered regions, complaints grew. Some communities sabotaged their stations. Others bribed riders to divert around their land. To counter this, the Mongols passed strict laws. Sabotaging the Yam was a capital offense. Riders were to be protected by force, their duties treated as sacred. Still, resentment simmered. The Yam was efficient, but it was not always loved. Despite its burdens, the Yam succeeded in creating something extraordinary, a connected world. Through its relay stations, a Persian doctor could send medical advice to a Chinese emperor. A Tibetan monk could be summoned to a court in Crimea. A Mongol princess in Samarkand could receive gifts from her cousin in the Khan's court. The Yam carried more than letters. It carried culture, knowledge, and power. It bound together deserts and mountains, tribes and cities, languages and loyalties. But what happened when that system began to fray? What did the end of the Yam look like? And how did it reflect the slow unraveling of the Mongol Empire itself? At its height, the Yam was not just a tool of governance or war. It was the spinal cord of Eurasian communication, holding together a mosaic of peoples, regions, and ideologies. From the bustling Silk Road cities of Central Asia to the icy frontiers of Rus, the Yam enabled a steady flow of intelligence, commerce, and control. But like all vast systems, it was only as strong as its weakest links. And as the Mongol Empire aged, its great roadways began to crack under pressure, slowly mirroring the political fragmentation of the Khans. Still, for decades, centuries, even, it worked. And it worked brilliantly. While the primary purpose of the Yam was to serve the imperial state, the relay network was used by far more than just government couriers. Thanks to the Yam, merchants enjoyed unprecedented safety and predictability across Eurasia. Under the Pax Mongolica, circa 1250 to 1350, Mongol rule enforced trade protections along vast stretches of the Silk Road. Inns and way stations allowed traders to rest and resupply. Armed escorts were occasionally provided through dangerous zones. Tariffs and customs were standardized, sometimes even waived. The Yam allowed goods to flow quickly and letters of credit to travel ahead of caravans, facilitating long-distance trade from Venetian glass to Chinese silk and Persian carpets. The Yam was also a tool of imperial surveillance. Along with official messengers, the network carried reports from informants and spy couriers who watched over governors, military commanders, and even other Khans. Genghis Khan and his successors placed great importance on timely intelligence. It was said that a falcon can fly no faster than a message on the Yam. In times of rebellion, this allowed a Khan to learn of unrest within days and respond before enemies could consolidate. The Mongol Empire was remarkably tolerant of religions, and they used the Yam to support interfaith communication. Nestorian Christian monks from Central Asia traveled freely to and from China. Buddhist lamas were summoned from Tibet to the Yuan court in Beijing. Muslim scholars sent theological inquiries to Baghdad or Bokhara. The Yam became a sacred highway, carrying both scripture and political influence between religious centers. None of this movement would have been possible without the Pesa, the iconic badge of Yam authority. These medallions or tablets, typically made of gold, silver, or bronze, were issued by the great Khan or his governors to trusted messengers, diplomats, and couriers. Engraved with the Khan's seal and often inscribed with orders like, "By the power of eternal heaven, assist this bearer," a Pesa was. A symbol of trust, not easily forged. A demand of obedience, often recognized even in distant provinces. A pass to resources, allowing the holder to requisition horses, food, and lodging at any station. However, the system relied on discipline. Abuse of Pesa privileges, especially by merchants or corrupt officials, became a growing problem. As the empire decentralized, some regional Khans began issuing their own versions, flooding the system with too many official travelers and overburdening relay stations. Managing the Yam across such vast distances required standardization, an early form of logistics planning. Distances between stations had to be carefully calculated based on terrain, population density, and military risks. Supply quotas had to be maintained by locals. Fodder for horses, yurts for shelter, and food for riders. Station records were kept in multiple scripts: Uyghur, Chinese, Mongolian, Arabic, depending on the region. Despite this, breakdowns were inevitable. Floods and snowstorms could close sections of the route for weeks. Tribal revolts or military campaigns could destroy stations. Logistical mismanagement meant some regions fell behind in supplying horses or food, forcing messengers to slow or detour. A scribe in Tabriz once recorded that a single broken relay station could delay an imperial order by a month, derailing entire campaigns or negotiations. The Mongol response? Punishment and redundancy. Station masters could be executed for negligence. Backup horses were kept in reserve at high-priority stations. Alternate routes were maintained, one for summer, another for winter. This level of logistical precision was unique in the medieval world. Even the best-run European kingdoms struggled to move messengers more than 30 to 40 km/day. The Mongols regularly outpaced them fivefold without roads, telegraphs, or rail. By the mid-14th century, however, the Yam began to falter, not because of poor design, but because of imperial fragmentation. After the death of Kublai Khan in 1294, the Mongol Empire splintered into four khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the steppes. While all inherited the Yam system, they no longer shared unified command. Rivalries broke out, borders hardened, and the Yam, which relied on seamless cooperation, began to unravel. Bribes and corruption plagued the system as local rulers exploited station managers. Wars between khanates cut major routes. Horses and supplies were requisitioned for military campaigns, leaving couriers stranded. In some regions, such as Persia under the Ilkhans, efforts were made to preserve and even improve the Yam. But in others, particularly the Chagatai Khanate, civil war and instability destroyed key infrastructure. Still, echoes of the Yam survived well into the 15th century. Even Timur Tamerlane, the Central Asian conqueror, adapted parts of the relay system for his campaigns. Later, Russian Tsars would emulate it in their own postal reforms. What happened to the Yam? In truth, it faded slowly, not with collapse, but with a quiet fading into irrelevance. As the Mongol Empire lost cohesion, local rulers prioritized their own roads, their own couriers, their own taxes. The Yam became too expensive, too abused, too mismanaged to maintain across fractured kingdoms. But its influence lived on. The Ottoman postal routes, the Tsar's couriers, and even Silk Road trade logistics in the early modern period owe a debt to the Yam. European travelers like Marco Polo described it with awe, comparing it to Roman roads and Persian messengers. Chinese and Persian historical records preserve detailed accounts of its function and organization. In a time without phones, trains, or printed maps, the Yam proved that connection was possible across deserts, mountains, languages, and belief systems. It was a postal system, yes, but it was also a triumph of planning, a marvel of endurance, and an act of imperial imagination. And when we ask ourselves how such a ferocious empire held itself together, not just by sword, but by information, the answer rides through the silence of steppe, from station to station. By the late 14th century, the Yam, once the living, breathing web of Mongol rule, was fraying into irrelevance. Like so much of the Mongol imperial machinery, it had been too dependent on unity, and unity was gone. Yet, in its decline, the Yam did not vanish overnight. It persisted in corners, in copies, in fragments. Even as the great Khans gave way to squabbling rulers, and the Mongol Empire fractured into bitter khanates and embattled provinces, the idea of the Yam remained. It lingered in the minds of scribes, traders, and local rulers who had once relied on it, and in the dusty outlines of abandoned relay posts, still standing like broken teeth across the steppe. Let's follow its final riders. By the time the Yam fell out of widespread use in the early 1400s, many of its couriers and caretakers had become something else entirely. Some became bandits, using their knowledge of remote routes and station locations to ambush caravans. Others found work as mercenary messengers, hired by local lords or war bands to ferry intelligence across dangerous terrain. The former glory of the Yam, riders galloping through open grassland with the Khan's seal and the Empire's breath in their saddlebags, had become a memory. In its place was a more desperate world. Fractured states, local kings, and emerging new powers like Ming China, Tsarist Russia, and the Timurid Empire, each building their own infrastructure, brick by brick. But even as the physical network crumbled, the method survived. Station keeping remained part of military logistics in Central Asia for centuries. Horse relays were used by the Ottomans, Persians, and Russians, often following ancient Yam routes. Mounted courier systems emerged independently in Mughal India and Safavid Iran, with striking similarities in spacing, function, and hierarchy. In some places, the ghost of the Yam was co-opted, not destroyed. One of the more peculiar legacies of the Yam lies not in its infrastructure, but in its cartography. Mongol administrators, especially during the reign of Kublai Khan, invested in mapping the empire. To manage the yam, they needed accurate records of distances, routes, and terrain. These maps, now lost to time, influenced Chinese and Persian geographers, many of whom reference relay routes as the basis for continental geography. In Persia, historians like Rashid al-Din documented the Mongol communication systems with admiration, noting their precision and speed. In China, the Yuan dynasty kept records of post road mileage, station inventories, and courier rosters, all of which inspired future dynasties to rebuild or imitate what they had inherited. The yam may have faded from physical use, but became embedded in the mental map of Eurasia. Even the Silk Road, a term coined centuries later, owes much of its functional existence to the relay routes maintained by the Mongols. Without reliable communications and safe rest stops, even the richest caravan would be doomed to the sands. In the West, the yam's legacy was more subtle, but no less profound. European travelers like Marco Polo, who passed through Mongol territory in the 1270s, were stunned by the efficiency of the yam. Polo compared it to Roman roads, but noted that the Mongols had horses at the ready at every station, and that messengers could ride with incredible swiftness. Polo's reports influenced later European thinkers, especially during the Renaissance, when questions of infrastructure and statecraft became more central. The Habsburg Empire studied courier models based on yam relay principles. In Muscovy, the Yamskoy Prikaz, the Russian postal office, was directly named after the Mongol yam, from whom the early Tsars had inherited much of their state structure. Even early British colonial administrations studied the logistics of steppe empires to understand imperial reach. In this way, the yam didn't vanish. It was absorbed, remembered, and reimagined. In the end, the yam was a system built for a world that moved on horseback. It was optimized for vast, open territories, where horses were abundant, human labor was conscripted, and the authority of a single ruler could command service across thousands of miles. But empires change. Technologies evolve. The 15th and 16th centuries brought gunpowder, sailing ships, city-states, and the slow centralization of European monarchies. Roads were paved. Couriers were replaced by paper bureaucracy and, centuries later, electric wires. And yet, the yam remains one of the greatest logistical systems ever created without modern tools. No steam, no engines, no telegraphs, just horses, discipline, saddlebags of secrets, and an empire's faith in its riders. The next time you track a package across continents, watch as it moves from hub to hub, Hong Kong to Dubai, Frankfurt to Cincinnati. Consider that once, long ago, someone in Karakoram handed off a letter to a stranger on a horse, trusting that it would reach another city thousands of miles away, through a system not unlike our own. They, too, had their roads, their stations, their couriers, their trust, and their silence, because the greatest mail systems do not make noise. They leave no speeches, no battles, no monuments, just letters in motion, and dust behind. You wake, not to the chirp of a smartphone or the ring of a bell, but to the color of the sky. A pale silver blue leaks through the cracks in your shutters. You stir, not because it is 6 a.m., but because the chickens begin to cluck and the dogs are barking down the road. There is no hour, no alarm, only rhythm, before the mechanical clock, before the ticking hand. Time was not measured in seconds or minutes. It was felt, watched, and inferred. The modern obsession with precision would have seemed alien, perhaps even absurd, to a peasant monk or merchant living in Europe in the year 1250. Time, back then, was relative, situational, and local. This is a story of how people kept time when clocks did not exist, or existed only in monasteries and towers far away. It's a story of shadows and bells, prayers and tides, candles and gut feeling. Long before the invention of mechanical devices, people used their bodies as the first and most reliable timekeepers. The human body, guided by light and circadian rhythm, was finely tuned to nature's clock. People rose with the sun and slept shortly after dusk. Meals followed the arc of daylight. Morning porridge, midday bread, evening stew. Labor was structured not by hours but by tasks. A farmer didn't plow from 8 to 12. He plowed until the sun passed a certain tree, or until the dew dried, or until his stomach told him it was time for a crust of bread. Time was experiential, not numerical. Children learned to tell time by watching shadows move or listening for animal calls. Church bells, when they rang, signaled only general parts of the day. Prime, terce, sext, none, roughly corresponding to sunrise, mid-morning, noon, and mid-afternoon. But few people cared if it was 9:15 or 9:45. To live without a clock was not chaotic. It was to be immersed in time rather than ruled by it. Nature offered a reliable, if imprecise, framework for tracking time. Used since ancient Egypt and Greece, the sundial remained a common tool well into the Middle Ages. These were not always fancy stone devices. Some were simple sticks in the ground, with circles marked in dirt. Monasteries and educated households used more sophisticated versions, calibrated to latitude and seasonal variation. But sundials had two problems. They required sun, and they only worked during the day. Even without a formal sundial, people judged time by shadow length. The angle of light at noon was different in December than in June. Experienced laborers and shepherds could estimate the time based on how a shadow fell across a wall or where the sun aligned with a familiar feature. The peak of a barn, the tip of a spire. In rural areas, nighttime was tracked by the position of stars. Farmers used constellations to mark seasons. Sailors followed the North Star. Some people learned to judge time during the night by watching the movement of familiar stars across the horizon, a practice common among nomadic herders and desert travelers. The phases of the moon also served as a calendar, guiding planting cycles, festivals, and even fishing expeditions. A full moon made night travel possible. A new moon signaled caution and rest. In many towns and villages, people heard time before they could see it. Perhaps the most consistent source of public time was the monastic bell. Monasteries rang bells at fixed intervals, marking the canonical hours of prayer. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. This rhythm divided the day into religious units, not secular ones. Even villagers who didn't understand Latin knew what each bell meant. Time to wake, time to work, time to pray, time to rest. Some cities passed laws regulating bell ringing. How often, how long, and how loud. Bells became the heartbeat of towns, echoing over rooftops and fields, telling the illiterate and the literate alike that something needed doing. In fields and workshops, songs served as a metronome. Rowers, weavers, and miners used rhythmic chants to coordinate labor. A repeated song could measure the passage of a task, if not a minute. You didn't work for an hour. You worked until the second verse ends, or until the seventh bag is filled. Time was embedded in action, not abstracted from it. Not everyone lived under open sky. In castles, cathedrals, or merchant homes, people sometimes used devices to measure passing time. Primitive but ingenious. A candle marked with lines at regular intervals served as a candle clock. As the wax melted, each line passed could represent a half hour or hour. Monks used these to keep vigil during night prayers. Some families burned candles as bedtime timers for children or during labor tasks. But wax was expensive. Poor families used rushlights, strips of dried rush dipped in fat, which burned quickly and unevenly. These couldn't measure time, only remind you how little of it you had. By controlling the amount of oil, one could roughly estimate how long a lamp would burn. A full lamp might last a few hours, a spoonful, perhaps 30 minutes. Night workers or readers, mostly monks or scholars, used this method to pace their tasks. Rare and expensive, clepsydras or water clocks were used in temples, palaces, and large cities. They worked by letting water drip slowly from one container into another. Once common in ancient Egypt and China, they made their way into Islamic and Byzantine courts, but remained unfamiliar to most Europeans until the late Middle Ages. Water clocks were prized for their quiet regularity, but difficult to maintain. Temperature changes affected flow, and dust easily clogged the works. Ultimately, time before clocks was not just natural, it was social. You met someone after the bells, or before the heat. Events happened between light and dark, or after the cows are milked. In some cultures, days were broken into segments named after tasks: the hour of prayers, the time of wheat turning, the third feeding. And because time was negotiated, it created shared flexibility. If you arrived late, it was understood the sun was blocked or the bell was faint. There was no minute hand to shame you. This lack of precision didn't mean people were lazy or disorganized. It meant that daily life was adapted to human needs and environmental limits. Time flowed with the seasons. People moved when they were ready. Actions, not numbers, governed the day. But that raises a question. What changed? How do we go from task-based living to regimented hours? When did the concept of being late even emerge? And how did the invention of the mechanical clock begin to reshape not just timekeeping, but human consciousness itself? Somewhere around the 13th century, in the damp, echoing halls of European monasteries, a new sound began to emerge. Not just a solemn toll of a bell, but the click and shift of gears, the mechanical rhythm of something that had never been heard before. It was the first generation of mechanical clocks, ticking not for beauty or wealth, but for prayer. And yet, in the centuries that followed, these clocks would escape the cloister and flood into cities, towers, homes, and factories. They would change more than timekeeping. They would change how humans thought, worked, slept, and measured their lives. Before the clock, time was cyclical, intuitive, communal. After the clock, time became linear, quantified, and increasingly controlled. The first mechanical clocks were not built to regulate commerce or daily life. They were created to regulate the canonical hours, the rhythm of prayer and Christian monastic life. In monasteries like those of the Benedictines and Cistercians, monks rose in darkness to recite matins, lauds, and prime. Some of these observances came in the dead of night, making traditional cues like the sun or shadow unreliable. The solution? A device that could track time consistently, regardless of light. The earliest clocks had no dials. They struck bells. This was enough. If the bell sounded, it was time to pray. These clocks were powered by weights and escapements, a revolutionary mechanism that allowed controlled, incremental movement. By the early 14th century, large, gear-driven clocks began appearing in cathedral towers, most notably in Salisbury Cathedral, UK, a 14th century clock still operational today. Padua, Italy, one of the first clocks with an astronomical dial. Strasbourg, France, famed for its elaborate automata and moving calendar. Still, few people saw these clocks up close. The tower bell remained the key communicator, heard by all, understood by most, and now measuring something more precise. By the 15th century, clockmaking became a professional craft. Cities hired artisans to build and maintain public clocks. These timepieces gained faces, hands, and sometimes astronomical features. They displayed the hour, but often also the phase of the moon, zodiac signs, and liturgical calendar. The presence of a visible clock changed how urban life was structured. Market openings could now be timed. Courts began proceedings on the hour. City gates were locked at a scheduled moment. Time had become a civic resource, visible to all, not just the clergy. But while public clocks were marvels of engineering, they were still inconsistent, drifting by minutes or even hours without adjustment. Yet their influence was enormous. People began talking about time in smaller units. Meetings moved from after Vespers to by the third bell or at the 9th hour. The day was splintering, and with it came the idea of being early or late, a concept that previously held little social weight. In port cities like Venice, Antwerp, and Bruges, the need for precision grew with the explosion of trade and finance. Merchants wanted to know when ships would dock. Debtors wanted due dates. Bankers required fixed hours for currency exchanges. Suddenly, time was money, and money required tracking. The growing merchant class began acquiring domestic clocks, often ornate and more for status than practicality. Still, their presence in homes and counting houses laid the foundation for personal time discipline. Meanwhile, mechanical watches emerged in the 16th century. These were notoriously inaccurate but symbolic, tools for the ambitious. They showed that a person valued time, even if they couldn't quite measure it. In Protestant regions, this precision took on moral weight. Calvinist and Puritan thinkers linked punctuality to godliness. Time wasted was seen as time stolen from God, from one's duties, or from economic productivity. The result? A cultural shift. To be late was now a sin. The Industrial Revolution would complete the transformation of time from organic to mechanical. In the 18th and 19th centuries, factories required standardized shifts, coordinated breaks, and synchronized outputs. Time was no longer local. It became factory time. Clocks were mounted on walls in workshops. Whistles or bells signaled shift changes. Workers were punched in and out. Here, timekeeping stopped being passive. It became discipline. Before the factory, a blacksmith might pause when his hands ached or when the light dimmed. Now, he worked the clock, even if that meant continuing in pain or dark. Children as young as 6 were expected to obey the factory bell. Entire families reorganized their lives around external schedules. Leisure, sleep, meals, everything bowed to the tyranny of minutes. Not everyone embraced this new rhythm. Peasants, living beyond the reach of city towers, continued using natural cues for centuries. Rural communities resisted clock-based schedules, especially when it conflicted with harvest cycles or religious traditions. In some parts of Europe, bell towers were vandalized, not out of spite, but in protest against the disruption of ancient rhythms. Even within cities, a dual time system emerged. Official time, clock hours, legal deadlines, factory shifts. Folk time, when the light breaks, before the moon rises, after the third rooster crow. This tension remained well into the 19th century, and even today, echoes persist. In rural areas, farmers still speak of light rather than hours. In oral cultures, storytelling still unfolds by memory, not stopwatch. As clocks spread, they reshaped not only behavior, but identity. A person once defined by seasonal labor was now expected to conform to clock labor. A shepherd working from dawn to dusk was replaced by a shift worker working from 8 to 4 o'clock. The shift was subtle but profound. Time went from something you lived with to something you obeyed. But this shift also brought benefits. Coordination of trade and communication. Scientific precision in experiments and navigation. Medical scheduling, legal systems, and transport logistics. Still, some lament what was lost. The quiet knowing of the day, the patience of the candle's melt, the softness of time unmeasured. Which raises a question. As we continue to divide the day into ever smaller pieces, minutes, seconds, milliseconds, what did we gain? And what did we begin to forget? Today, you can know the precise time down to the nanosecond. Your phone syncs with atomic clocks orbiting in satellites, constantly correcting for drift. Your smartwatch buzzes when it's time to breathe. Digital clocks blink in microwaves, cars, elevators, dashboards, and meeting rooms. We are surrounded by measured time, almost incapable of escaping it. But for most of human history, time was not this way. It was not possessed, only perceived. It was not cut into clean rectangles on calendars or announced by vibrating glass rectangles in our pockets. It was the curve of the sun, the arc of seasons, the feel of the body, and the stories passed down about when to plant, when to rest, and when to pray. As mechanical clocks spread and modernity marched forward, humanity began a transformation not just in how time was kept, but in how time was felt. Let's consider what that meant. One of the most profound effects of clock-based society was the standardization of time zones, a concept unknown before the 19th century. In a pre-clock world, every village had its own noon, defined by the position of the sun overhead. A merchant traveling 50 miles west might find that his noon was now 30 minutes later. But with the invention of railways and telegraphs, this chaotic patchwork became untenable. Trains needed timetables, and telegrams required synchronized clocks. So, in the 1880s, standard time zones were established, first by private railway companies, then formalized by governments. Greenwich Mean Time became the anchor for a global system. For the first time, time was no longer local. It was imposed, fixed, abstract. Entire countries adjusted their lives to fit a grid that ignored local weather, tradition, and daily rhythm. It was efficient. It was logical. But it was not human. The industrial age accelerated this transformation. Time was no longer just measured. It was monetized. Wages were calculated hourly. Productivity was tracked per minute. Lunch breaks, factory shifts, and school bells divided the day into strict zones. The result was a new kind of worker, one not governed by weather or harvest, but by schedules, deadlines, and alarms. This shift even changed our language. Before clocks, people spoke in terms like a while after sunset, when the dew lifts, until the cock crows. After clocks, we began to say, meet me at 2:30. Your break is over at 1:45. You're 9 minutes late. The change was gradual but total. Time had become a discipline, enforced by bells, bosses, and eventually ourselves. Living by the clock introduced a new kind of anxiety, one that had no equivalent in ancient or medieval worlds. People began to speak of wasting time, as though time were a coin or fuel that could be used up. This idea, novel and invisible in pre-clock cultures, became central to capitalist society. Punctuality became not just practical, but moral. A late arrival was seen as a sign of disrespect, not just bad luck. Idle time was viewed as lazy, not restful. Children were taught to watch the clock, to work on time management, and to produce on schedule. Even our sense of aging became more clock-based. In ancient societies, age was loosely defined. She's in her planting years, or he's past the time for war. But now, we mark age by the calendar and mourn the passage of time in birthdays, deadlines, and expiration dates. We do not feel old, we are told we are. And yet, clock time has never entirely replaced the old rhythms. In rural farming communities, the land still rules. Crops do not care what time it is, only what season it is. Animals still rise with the sun, not the bell. Even in cities, people seek ways to return to natural time. Mindfulness practices encourage tuning into the body's rhythms. Seasonal diets and circadian fasting echo ancient wisdom. Digital detoxes attempt to recapture a time before screen time took over every hour. And during power outages, long hikes, or retreats from technology, we sometimes rediscover what it means to lose track of time and feel strangely free. In these moments, we remember what our ancestors knew all along, that not all time is measured and not all clocks tick. The journey from natural time to mechanical time, from sunlight to stopwatch, is one of the quietest and most profound shifts in human history. We now live not only in time, but by time. Our calendars structure our weeks, our clocks dictate our waking, and our very memories are ordered by time stamps. We have gained precision, productivity, and power, but we have lost something, too. We have lost the seasonal patience of our ancestors, who waited for first frost or the spring bloom to act. We have lost the communal tempo, where a bell told everyone, not just you, what came next. We have lost the ability to let time pass without counting it. So the next time you check your watch or feel the anxiety of a ticking deadline, consider this. There was a time when no one knew what time it was, and life still moved forward. Sunrise to sunset, seed to harvest, child to elder. It wasn't faster. It wasn't slower. It was simply time, and that was enough. Tucked away in a stone alcove, behind thick wooden doors and rows of chained books, sits a figure hunched over a lectern. His eyes are red from hours of copying. His fingers are stained black with ink. His candle is flickering, though it's still midday. Outside, monks chant in the chapel, and laborers haul water from the well. But here, in the silent scriptorium, nothing moves except the slow glide of a quill. This is a monastery librarian, not the kind who shelves books, but the kind who creates them, preserves them, and guards them like treasure. It is the year 1150, and you are inside one of the most intellectually active places in Europe, a Benedictine monastery in northern France. And though the rest of the world stumbles through mud and war, behind these walls, the written word is being saved one letter at a time. The work is boring, the life is monotonous, but its consequences will last 1,000 years. In the medieval world, librarians were not academics in cardigans. They were monks, members of religious orders like the Benedictines, Cistercians, or later Franciscans and Dominicans. Their job was not just to collect books, but to copy, catalog, and protect them. Most monasteries had no more than a few dozen volumes. A wealthy one might have 200 or 300. A few, like the great libraries of Monte Cassino, Cluny, or St. Gall, amassed thousands. These collections represented centuries of effort, and often the only copies of surviving Roman, Greek, or early Christian works. Librarians fell into a few key roles. The scribe, scriptor, responsible for writing and copying texts. The corrector, who reviewed texts for spelling, grammar, and theological accuracy. The illuminator, who decorated manuscripts with initials, gold leaf, and tiny scenes. The armarius, the chief librarian, who oversaw the collection, managed lending rare, and kept track of inventory. Each position was bound by strict silence, long hours, and often physical discomfort. The work was seen as an act of devotion, not intellectual vanity. At the heart of the monastery was a scriptorium, a room dedicated to writing. Not all monasteries had one. Only those with enough wealth, resources, and literate monks. Here, in a cold, sunlit space, monks sat at rows of wooden desks known as lecterns, each one angled for comfort. The scriptorium was unheated, to protect parchment from moisture, bright, with large windows facing east or south, silent by rule, talking was forbidden except for designated hours, organized, with separate spaces for drying, binding, and storage. Each monk copied with a quill pen made from goose feathers, trimmed to a sharp point. Ink was handmade from oak gall, iron salts, and gum arabic, a slow, smelly process that stained everything. Parchment, made from animal skins, had to be scraped, stretched, and smoothed before writing. Each sheet took days to prepare. A full Bible might require 200 sheepskins and a year of labor. To prevent errors, scribes read aloud to themselves as they wrote. They were trained to avoid flair, copying with precision, not originality. Even the layout of each page was planned with rulings, lines drawn lightly to guide margins and columns. Monks lived by the rule of St. Benedict, which divided the day into fixed hours of prayer, labor, and reading. A typical day might include matins night prayer at 2:30 a.m., lauds at dawn, prime after sunrise, terce, sext, none, mid-morning to mid-afternoon prayers, vespers at sunset, compline before bed. Copying work happened in the intervals between services, usually mid-morning and afternoon. A monk might spend 4 to 6 hours per day writing, though some, especially dedicated scribes, were given special permissions to devote their entire time to copying. It was slow, repetitive, and demanding. Monks complained of back pain, eye strain, hand cramps, and the constant threat of smudging wet ink. In one 12th century manuscript, a scribe wrote in the margin, "The ink is thin, the parchment is hairy, the lamp is dim, I am very cold." And yet, he finished the page. The answer, whatever was worth saving. Monasteries prioritized religious texts, Bibles, psalters, theological treatises by church fathers like Augustine or Jerome, liturgical books, missals, breviaries, hymnals for church services, monastic rules, such as the rule of St. Benedict, or instructions for managing the monastery, saints' lives, hagiographies detailing the miracles and virtues of holy men and women, classical texts, works of Cicero, Virgil, Aristotle, and Galen, often copied with hesitation or marginal warnings about pagan wisdom. Sometimes, monks copied local records, land deeds, annals, weather observations, or chronicles of their own monastery's history. Most texts were in Latin, the language of the church, though Greek and Hebrew were known in larger abbeys. Vernacular languages were considered less sacred and thus less frequently preserved. Once copied, books were bound in wooden covers, sometimes with leather and metal clasps, cataloged by the armarius in a handwritten ledger, chained to shelves or desks to prevent theft. Books were rare and worth more than gold, stored in armaria, cupboard-like shelves, or dedicated library rooms. Monasteries occasionally lent books to trusted clergy or other abbeys, but always under strict conditions. Fines for lost books were severe. Some monasteries required witnesses and pledges for loans. Many books carried curse inscriptions, such as, "If anyone steals this book, may be roasted on a spit in hell." It's not clear how often the curses worked, but book theft was rare, mostly because few could read, and even fewer could sell stolen manuscript without raising suspicion. To be a monastery librarian was not glamorous. It was monotonous, often isolated, and certainly thankless in its time. But it was essential. Without these quiet men, hunched in candlelit rooms, we would not have the works of Aristotle, passed through Islamic scholars and back to Europe, the plays of Plautus and histories of Livy, early medical treatises, astronomy guides, and herbal manuals. Even the Bible, as we know it, copied, illuminated, and preserved generation after generation. They lived lives measured in pages, not years. They left no grand tombs, no heroic sagas, no known faces, only books. And the books, in turn, preserved everything else. But what happened when the world began to shift? When printing arrived, when literacy spread, and when books poured forth not one at a time, but by the hundreds, did the monastery librarian vanish? Or did he evolve? For centuries, the monastery librarian had reigned supreme over the written word. He copied texts with care, guarded parchment with vigilance, and treated the act of transcription as an act of prayer. But by the 15th century, something began to rattle the world of scriptoria, a whisper first, then a roar, the printing press. And with it came a deluge of books, a rising tide of lay literacy, and the slow unraveling of a world where a single monk might spend a year producing just one Bible. The librarian's candle would flicker for a while longer, but the darkness had already changed. In the 1450s, Johannes Gutenberg introduced his movable type press in Mainz, Germany. At first, its reach was limited. Books were still expensive, and the first printed texts were designed to look like manuscripts, complete with imitation margins and blank spaces for illustrations to be added by hand. But the implications were immediate. A manuscript Bible might take a year to copy. Gutenberg's press could print over 180 Bibles in 3 years, and with near-identical accuracy. For the monastery librarian, this was both a blessing and a threat. Some saw it as a miracle. Finally, the Word of God could reach more souls. Others viewed it with suspicion. The loss of control, the creeping influence of secular printers, the danger of error or heresy. Many monasteries continued copying manuscripts well into the 16th century, unwilling or unable to transition to print. In some regions, the printing press was seen as unspiritual, a mechanical replacement for sacred labor. But in truth, the days of the scriptorium were numbered. As printing spread across Europe, the role of the librarian began to change. Monks were no longer the sole producers of books. They were now receivers, organizers, and sometimes censors. The library that once added 2 or 3 new volumes a year might now receive dozens. This required new systems. Cataloging methods had to be invented or revised. Books were no longer chained. There were too many. Parchment gave way to cheaper paper, which needed different storage conditions. Printed indexes and title pages allowed easier sorting and referencing. Some monasteries expanded their libraries rapidly, incorporating works of science, medicine, law, and even classical pagan literature, texts once viewed with suspicion. In Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries, abbeys became centers of learning, attracting scholars from the rising universities. The librarian's work shifted from creation to curation. Then came Luther. In 1517, Martin Luther's 95 Theses, printed and reprinted across Europe in weeks, sparked the Protestant Reformation. Suddenly, the printed word wasn't just fast. It was dangerous. Monastery libraries became targets. Protestant reformers accused monks of hoarding texts, hiding truth behind Latin and chained books. Catholic defenders feared that printers were spreading heresy, misinterpretation, and blasphemy. In some regions, monastic libraries were ransacked, books burned or seized, collections dispersed. The monastery librarian now found himself in a strange and shifting position. He was no longer the sole authority on sacred texts. He was now a gatekeeper in a war of words. Some librarians resisted change, hiding books in crypts or behind false walls. Others adapted, learning to use print themselves, working with sympathetic printers, or translating Latin texts into vernacular languages for wider readership. In both cases, the idea of sacred exclusivity was dying. By the 17th century, many monasteries had closed, and many libraries had been absorbed into universities, cathedrals, or private collections. Monastic libraries that remained began hiring or training lay librarians, often university-educated men with scholarly credentials but no religious vows. These new librarians were catalogers of thousands of printed works, bibliographers developing systems of classification, archivists preserving fragile manuscripts in the face of growing neglect. Scholars, studying ancient texts, annotating them, and preparing them for publication. In many cases, they still relied on the quiet labor of monks, especially in older abbeys, but the center of gravity had shifted. The age of the copyist was over. The age of the curator had begun.